Welcome to Casey Cares, Kansas City's nonprofit voice. We're telling the stories of Kansas City nonprofits and the people behind them. Casey Cares is the intersection of the nonprofit and profit communities, making Kansas City a better place to live, work, and play. I'm Ruth Baum-Biggis, your host. This Casey Cares segment is brought to you by the Ewing Marion Kauffman Foundation, www.kauffman.org. Poverty affects so many in the world today. It's daunting at times to know how to help. Based in Kansas City, the international nonprofit organization Unbound has developed a model to help those who are marginalized and vulnerable around the globe. They use relationships to provide education, food, healthcare, and jobs. Founded in 1981 by two brothers, their sister, and friends, Unbound is making miracles happen across the globe. So how does that happen? Well, here to tell us is Unbound CEO Scott Wasserman. Scott, welcome. It's so good to have you.
Thanks, Ruth. Thanks for inviting me.
And we'll be a little honest. We'll throw it out there to our audience. We go back just a little ways, not terribly far, right, to when we were in high school.
Absolutely. I grew up here in Kansas City, graduated from Shawnee Mission South.
Nothing greater than a Raider. Okay, we had to say it. You know, we got to give a little plug for our alma mater. But you're doing things way, way beyond. So my first introduction really to Unbound is driving along Southwest Traffic Way. And I would always pass the building, see your logo and go, I've got to check this organization out. I did, but I want you to share with us, what is Unbound?
Unbound, as you said, Ruth, was formed in 1981 here in Kansas City. We've been headquartered here in Kansas City from the beginning and remain here to this day. However, I describe ourselves sometimes as your local, neighborhood, global nonprofit. While based in Kansas City, we work in 19 countries around the world. We form personal connections between people mostly living in the United States with people growing up in the developing world. So you could sponsor a child or a family directly or an elder person. We're the only major sponsorship organization that also works with the elderly around the world to help relieve them of their isolation. And what happens on the other end when you sponsor a child is that we work with the moms and the families. Usually it's the moms who are available to do this. They form with other women in their community, and it becomes very grassroots, 12 to 15 moms working together with support from our sponsors and from Unbound to lift themselves out of poverty.
That's amazing, and that is a big, big task. Where to start? How do you do this?
So it's very much we strongly believe that the best path out of poverty is a self-directed path, that these women know what their families need. They are the experts in their families. We aren't here in Kansas City. Our goal and our role is to support the moms in lifting their families out of poverty, but they choose the path. They choose how they're going to use the benefits. Of course, we have accountability. We have audits. We have social workers checking in on them. So there is accountability, but accountability is different than direction. We want to empower the moms to lead Unbound. They're the ones in charge of Unbound for their families and for their communities. And so the scale of this might be kind of surprising, Ruth. Because you said that you've driven past our building at about 31st and Southwest Boulevard, and it's a kind of a nondescript former warehouse building there. And people are sometimes surprised to find what a large organization Unbound is. We work with more than 275,000 families around the world. We reach out to them through personal outreach. Our funding model, as I was saying, is one-to-one sponsorship rather than institutional financing. And so we finance those 275,000 families with much appreciated, but relatively small contributions from more than 230,000 individuals. um, and and so the way I will sometime put it to people is last year we distributed about $140 million to these families around the world. Imagine if you were put in charge of a nonprofit and your task was to raise $140 million with the constraint that you need to raise it $40 at a time.
All right, so there's a challenge to talk about, which other nonprofits can relate to. So how do you all do it? I mean, that's a lot of money going $40 at a time.
That's a lot of money going $40 at a time. So we invite people to sponsor a child, a family, and as I say, that those contributions from the sponsors are so much appreciated. That is our funding model. But it's a relatively small amount from each person. We're asking for $40 a month and with that $40 a month, you'd be amazed, Ruth, at how far that goes, what an impact it makes for education, for nutrition, for housing, for starting small businesses. They can take it so far. And again, the reason it's so successful, the reason that money goes so far is, first of all, we give most of it to our program. Last year, more than 92% of our expenses was spent on program support. So we have a very favorable expense ratio. And once it's received by the family, they make it go so far because they're in charge of what they're going to do with it. And so they know, as I was earlier saying, they know what's going to work for their family much more than we could ever guess. I'll give you an example, Ruth. I was traveling in Uganda a few years ago, and I found that the families there were building racks. And I saw these racks, and they were talking with me. They were saying, we're using our sponsorship benefits to build racks. And I was asking myself, why is everyone so interested in building racks? And then after visiting a few homes, I discovered this one home that had dishes on the rack. I said, oh, they're dish drying racks. What's the big deal about building dish drying racks? So after having been in Uganda for about a week, I was beyond the point of trying to pretend that I knew anything. I didn't mind asking stupid questions by that point. And so I asked my host, why is everyone so interested in building dish racks? And she was very patient with me and respectful. She said, because when they washed their dishes, they used to put them on the ground. Chickens would walk across them, tracking in dirt, bacteria, droppings by walking across the dishes. The people were getting sick. And because they were getting sick, they had to use their sponsorship benefits to treat their illness rather than investing their sponsorship benefits in education and starting small businesses. And so their solution, the families themselves came up with the solution that what they needed most in the world was dish drying racks. We never would have guessed that from Kansas City, never would have occurred to us. And if we had gone out to our beloved sponsors and said, we're trying to raise money for dishwashing racks, that would have been a challenge to get people to understand why that is important to the families. So our model is that we invite people to sponsor individual families, and they know when they're sponsoring the family that the families themselves are going to be choosing how to use those benefits. Again, with accountability, we'll be there to make sure the money is not misused, but it's very self-directed, and we believe that's the success of our model. In addition to being a very effective way to come out of poverty, to walk out of poverty, it's also empowering. These women have been marginalized. They've been told their whole lives that they are incapable. At Unbound, we like to say that we see potential, not poverty. And so by supporting the women, giving them some funds, we give them some ideas about what's worked at other places, but tell them they're in charge of deciding what they're going to do in their family and their community. It changes the way they view themselves. They start to view themselves as agents of positive change in their communities.
That's amazing. So many questions. How did you all initially land in the countries where you are? There's many countries, as we all know, around the globe that could use support.
Yeah, that's a. Of course, it's evolved over the years. In the very early years of Unbound, it was because we knew someone there. Okay, that was how it started 40 years ago. Of course, we're much more sophisticated than that these days. Now we have explicit criteria that we look at. We have a grid where we look at different data, such as the economic development in the country. Unbound is not a relief organization. We aren't set up like Red Cross is or Catholic Relief Services. We're not set up to fly tents into a place that's recovering from a national disaster. We do, by the way, support our sponsored families when they go through natural disasters, such as hurricanes and earthquakes. But we need a certain level of economic development within the country in order for our model to work, but not so high a level that the support is ineffective. So that's an example of one of the many criteria that we look at. We look at levels of corruption, unfortunately. We look at levels of corruption to see that we can run a reliable program, a trustworthy program that our sponsors can believe in. And believe it or not, there are measurements, public measurements about different levels of corruption in different countries around the world. We look at levels of inequality around the world. So we have some very sophisticated ways of knowing where our program is going to be successful and trustworthy and reliable. And that's how we choose where we're working. So as I said, Ruth, currently we are working in 19 countries around the world. They are in Asia, Latin America, and Africa.
Now, do you have boots on the ground all the time with where your families are? So that, that steward model, not that the whole, let's believe that people are good. And if they're given that money, unfortunately, sometimes that isn't, the case. But so how does it work with your team?
I'm so glad you brought up our team because I love our team. I love our team members around the world. And we do not hire people in the United States to go abroad. We hire people from the communities. A large number of our team members grew up in Unbound. I met this young woman in Medellin, Colombia, and she was what we call a sub-project coordinator, a pretty high responsible position. And I said to her, Tatiana, how long have you been involved in Unbound? And what I meant was, how long have you been employed by Unbound? But she answered me, since I was 1 year old. I said, oh, you were a sponsored child. She said, I was sponsored when I was 1 year old. I eventually became what we call a scholarship student, which is for high school and college. Then I became a staff member, and now I am a sub-project coordinator. So she's been involved in Unbound all her life. I was walking through a very marginalized community in India with one of our social workers, and she was pointing out to me as we were walking through, they were like 2 or 3 story apartments on both sides of the street. We have a sponsored family in that apartment there, and a sponsored family on the top level there, and on the bottom level there. I said, wow, you really know this community. She says, I grew up here. I still live here. So these people are from those communities. They know what they're doing. They know whom they're working with. I mentioned earlier my trip in Uganda. Our national coordinator of our program in Uganda was herself a sponsored child. Grew up as a sponsored child. So we work with the local people to run the program for their own communities. So that's very much a part of who Unbound is that yes, we're global, our reach is far, but we're also very local. We're very local in each one of the places where we work. And by the way, Ruth, that includes here in Kansas City. That's why I started off earlier saying we are your local neighborhood global nonprofit. We know that we are from Kansas City, and we're proud to be here in Kansas City. We've been working in Kansas City since 1981. We have here in Kansas City area about 140 employees. And so we enjoy being a member of this community and a contributor to this community here in Kansas City, just as we are very local contributors in each of the communities where we work around the world.
We're talking with Scott Wasserman. He's the CEO of Unbound, 100 employees here in Kansas City. So it's so localized. What are the folks here in Kansas City doing to support your mission?
So here in Kansas, great question. And so it's about 140 employees here in Kansas City. And of course, there's some central coordination that has to happen. Some of that is just administrative work, okay? We do the back office work for the global Unbound community. We're also responsible for keeping this beautiful global network together. And the way we keep it together is interesting. Rather than doing it in a very controlling way, what binds the Unbound community together around the world is shared history, shared values, shared mission. And you would be amazed, Ruth, when I travel around the world, just how unified Unbound is. And at the same time, how local it is at each place. So every place, whether it's India, Uganda, Latin America, it has the culture of the local community because, as I said, even all the staff members are from that local community. And yet the shared value, the shared culture is very clear that every place I go to, these places are unbound, and we can talk to each other using some of our cultural phrases that will be instantly recognizable, and we know what we mean when we talk to each other. I'll give you one example, Ruth, just as an illustration. So for you're traveling for several hours on a highway, like I was just a couple of weeks ago in 4 weeks ago in the Dominican Republic, traveling along on a highway for a couple of hours, there's always some point where your vehicle pulls off the highway and you start bouncing around on some undeveloped road. And the phrase that we always say to each other when we do that, when we make that turn, is we always say, Unbound begins where the paved road ends. And I heard that phrase in the Dominican Republic. I've heard it in Africa. I've heard it in India. And every time that I hear it, I know, oh, here we go, hold on. And we use that phrase, Unbound begins where the paved road ends, literally, when we turn off the paved road, because the paved road doesn't reach our sponsored families. We use it metaphorically to indicate a spirit of adventure, a willingness to try new things, to turn off of the paved road and go into areas that are not paved and try to make our way.
So you're doing incredible work. You've helped, hundreds of thousands of children and families. Can you spend a minute and talk about what you're doing for older adults? So many times I think they get left out.
Oh, thank you so much for asking about them, Ruth. We are so pleased that, to our knowledge, we're the only major sponsorship organization that is serving the elderly in our communities. And so their needs are different, obviously, than a child's needs are. Children are interested in education. We've surveyed and listened to the elder adults that we work with and asked them, what do you need most? And we were expecting healthcare, nutrition, and that did come up. They do need that. But the number one need that they expressed was socializing. They feel isolated. And so we organize activity. We still do the nutrition. They need that. They need the healthcare. But we also organize opportunities for them to get together with other people, often with other older adults, sometimes with younger people too. And that is so affirming and energizing to them. One time I was traveling with some of our sponsors, and we invite sponsors to travel with us. And we were traveling in the Philippines, and he was meeting his sponsored friend because she had just turned 102 years old. And he had a great sense of humor. He said, yeah, when I started sponsoring, and he had sponsored her for 20 years. So when I started sponsoring her 20 years ago, I chose to sponsor an 82-year-old woman instead of a child because I didn't want a long-term commitment. And 20 years later, here he was. And he had been writing to her because we do facilitate a relationship, a real personal, authentic relationship. And he had been writing back and forth with her and asked her, I'm going to come visit you. What can I bring you? And she asked for a blanket. So he had packed a blanket. And while I was there, I got to see him take out the blanket. She was sitting in her chair and draping it over her shoulders. We came out and I said, Tom, that was really beautiful. I could tell he was very moved by that. And he was almost in tears. And he said, that was the blanket my late wife used after her chemo treatments when she was feeling chills. Mm-hmm. She passed away 6 months ago. And I thought it was time to let the blanket come here.
What a wonderful story. A wonderful story. You had been busy during the pandemic, which is amazing to me. How did you maneuver that with all its challenges?
Well, congratulations to everyone watching this, that you've also done very well during this pandemic, and I admire you for that. I'll share with you what we did in Unbound that helped us get through it, because maybe this would help you too. So remember back in March, April of 2020?
Yeah, it was not fun. It was not fun.
Sitting in my basement going, what just happened? and what's going to happen next? And I started thinking, okay, what does our community, the whole global Unbound community, need, and what do they need from me and my role at this moment? And I said, well, they need two things. They need confidence and they need security. I mean, certainty. And I thought, well, how can I give them confidence and certainty in these circumstances, which are not very certain? We didn't know what was happening then, remember? So there were two things I shared. One was adapting to massive challenges is not new to our sponsored families. They make their way doing this their whole lives. Let's learn from our sponsored families. Let's be inspired by them. If they can do this their whole lives, we can do it now for a few years. The other thing, when we talked about certainty, I needed to give some certainty, but I wanted to be authentic about it. There was a lot of uncertainty back in early 2020. So I said, so what can we be certain about? I went back to our core values: dignity of the person, relationships of mutual respect, transparency, and accountability. And I was thinking, you know what? I can promise and be very certain about this promise that we will maintain our core values both throughout this process and when we come out at the other end of it. And so I was able to give that assurance, and I could give that assurance with great certainty, and I told our community that you will see our core values as we continue to adapt. We will adapt. There's going to be a lot of changes. And to be frank with you, at that time, I don't know what those changes are going to be necessarily. We're still figuring that out. Unbound begins where the paved road ends. But I can promise you that we will come out of this with those core values intact, and that you will see the core values maintained throughout the process. We're not going to compromise on core values and say that we'll give up on dignity of the person for a little while just until we can get back on track. We're not going to do that. We will consistently follow our values while we're adapting our methods.
You were still able to get support in, correct?
The support came in and it went to the families, and fortunately, that never faltered. And fortunately, we had been working for years to do more digital funds transfers directly to our families. And so fortunately, that was already in place. And so the funds were still going to them. And Ruth, that was so more essential than ever, because most of our sponsored families live in a very informal economy. They do day work. They work on construction. If they don't work that day, they don't get paid that day. The women will set up their tortilla stands on the side of the road and sell tortillas. But if people aren't leaving their homes and they're not on the road, they're not going to sell any tortillas. So our sponsored families, fortunately, already had their accounts set up to receive digital transfers. We were still able to support them throughout the pandemic. So the support never faltered. And our sponsors, so grateful to our sponsors, they never faltered either. They kept supporting their sponsored friends. They were loyal. They were generous. Many of our sponsors even sent special funds to help their sponsored friends in through the pandemic. So our sponsors were loyal. Our sponsors were generous. Our team members in the field, remember, they live in those communities, and they were innovative and dedicated. I'll give you an example. So they switched a lot to using smartphones. You'd be surprised that how many smartphones there are, even in very impoverished communities, because the companies basically give them away for free, but you have to pay for the minutes. And so that's what the challenge is. It's not a challenge to get a phone. It's a challenge to get minutes on your phone. Because our local staff live in those communities, they saw what was going on. They switched some of the benefits to buy minutes on the phone so they could stay in touch with the families. The families could still write to their sponsors by typing in on their smartphones the letters that would go to our staff, and from there to the sponsors. And then I was in Guatemala, and our national coordinator there was saying, but there were some communities that are so remote in Guatemala, they don't even have cell phone service. And I said, so how did you reach them? And he said, well, there's an AM radio station in that town. And we went to the radio station, and he gave us a 30-minute weekly show. And we had the Unbound show. And they would go on to the AM radio station, and they would make announcements. They would tell people where the meetings were going to be. They would do some shout outs. We want to say happy birthday to Anita Ramirez. They would tell people what their participation requirements were for Unbound. And so they ran it all from this 30-minute weekly radio show. So, wow.
That's incredible, Scott. I want to share with our audience, please go check out everything at unbound.org. You're doing amazing work. Continue doing that work. We thank you for sharing your story.
Thank you, Ruth.
Thank you for joining us on KC Cares, Kansas City's nonprofit voice. We're produced by Charitable Communications, also a nonprofit. This KC Cares segment was brought to you by the Ewing, Marion Kauffman Foundation, www.kauffman.org. If you'd like to be a guest on KC Cares or Underwriting Opportunities, check out our website, KCCaresOnline.org. Spread the love and find us on Facebook and Twitter at KC Cares Radio and on Instagram at KC Cares Online. And catch us on Saturday mornings at 8 a.m. on ESPN 1510 AM and 94.5 FM. Thank you for joining us at KC Cares.